Alrighty, Push Nation, it's Mr. Majewski. So, I recorded the entire video covering the entire notes, and for some reason the second half of it didn't record. So here I am, late at night, because I love you guys very much, re-recording the same video I've already done once, making sure it records this time. So, if I look at the timer a lot, and you can see that, you'll know why. I'm making sure the freaking thing is timing as we are going along. Anyways, sounds to me like I left off right at the top of the second page, the back side of the page, I should say. I think perhaps the video camera bugged it out the last time, so I'm going to go sans video, which is no big loss, other than you get to see this handsome creature. Now you just get to listen to his voice. Anyways, top of the back page. Why did popular opinion turn against President Hoover during the Great Depression? Because there was a perception he wasn't doing enough, that he was slow to respond, that he didn't sympathize with the working man, and that he was too late. He did too little too late when he did finally react. So, hey, that's devastating when you're experiencing this sort of economic crisis, this collapse, to have a president who seems out of touch with that. That was doom for him. Who did he think should primarily assist those affected by the Depression? Remember, he's a hardcore conservative of the 1920s. So, he believes that you rely on your family, on your churches, on your charities, on yourself, right? You didn't go to the government. You didn't go for handouts. That just made you reliant on the government. So you couldn't have that. So therefore, he thought you were ultimately on your own and you looked to those around you. What was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation? Finally, when he did react to the Great Depression, this was his plan. About $500 million. It went, unfortunately for him, towards banks and corporations. So it just reinforced the idea that he only looked out for the rich, that he wasn't looking out for the working man. Now remember, this fit perfectly with his ideas, trickle-down economics, because you give the money to the banks and to the corporation, and ultimately they use it to build so that they can hire more workers and pay higher wages. Unfortunately, it was again viewed as inhumane by many observers in regards to what was happening to so many people in the country. What was the Dust Bowl? Obviously, it's an environmental economic collapse of agriculture. It happens because of two different reasons, one man-made, one environmental. It occurred in the Midwestern portions of the United States. What effect did it have on agriculture? It was devastating to it, especially in those areas. It forced the closure of many of those farms. Those farmers had to migrate out west and become migrant workers, hence books like The Grapes of Wrath. Why was it caused? It was caused largely because of drought. That was the environmental reasons. And then secondarily, it was caused by overproduction of crops, which destroyed the soil that the crops were being grown on, because the nutrients in there were being devastated. There were a series of windstorms over those years. They would pick up this devastated topsoil, which essentially had been turned almost into a sand-like substance, and carry it away. Ultimately, farms were devastated and destroyed. What was the major reason why Prohibition was abolished in 1933? Well, because it wasn't working, first off, but more importantly, because it led to all these other unforeseen problems like the rise of gangsterism, crime, prostitution, speakeasies. All of these things were going on. It clearly wasn't working. It led to a whole slew of other issues. Get rid of it. By the way, we're in the Depression. Some folks might like to drink legally to help them get through the tough times. New Deal notes. What were the 100 days? What legislation was passed during that time? That was the first 3 months of FDR's presidency after he was inaugurated. Remember, just this massive amount of legislation passed in a relatively short time to show to the American public he was going to be aggressive, he was going to come out swinging against the Depression, in contrast to his predecessor, Hoover. What was the Brain Trust? What did they do? They were his circle of advisors. They were made up of his wife, Eleanor, a series of cabinet advisors, obviously, including Frances Perkins, a woman, Harold Ickes, Harry Hopkins. Those were guys that helped set up the jobs programs. It included Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State. It was the people that he relied on to help him construct his New Deal policies. What were the 3 R's in the New Deal? Relief, immediate plans to immediately fix the problems that were plaguing the nation, get people back to work, get people to stay into their homes, stop getting these farms closed, fix the banks. These were problems that were immediate fixes and immediate solutions to stop the immediate problems of the Depression. Then we went into reforms. Those were reforms that were medium term. They were designed to get the country back to an economic status at or up to the Great Depression. So get us back to where we were before the Depression hit. And then ultimately reforms. These would be long-term, maybe even permanent. These would be reforms that would be based on making changes so that we would never have a Great Depression-like economic situation again in this country. Those were what the 3 R's were for. You need to be able to know the programs in your notes. You need to know the food bowl programs, at least generally. Kind of be able to give a, few word sentence. Oh, it was a jobs program that, employed people in the natural parks area, the CCC. And specifically, you should know, how did FDR support banking reform? Well, remember, he declares a banking holiday where he closes all banks in the country. He only allows banks that are solvent, that have the money to cover their debts, to reopen. So the American public knows only those banks that are left are legit. And then he passed the Glass-Steagall Act, the Emergency Banking Reform Act, 2 names for the same bill, which established the FDIC, guaranteed money. So people had the faith, after his fireside chats, to go back, to take their money back into banks again, because they knew it would be guaranteed, it'd be protected from this point forward. Unemployment relief, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, at one point 40% of our country was employed through that $11 billion program. Massive program, employed all sorts of public works, even down to like the bare minimum, a few hours a day in some instances. Other jobs programs, CCC, right, Civilian Conservation Corps. We can't forget about the TVA, even though it really was designed to bring electricity and build dams. It also was a massive employment program as well throughout the South. There were others. I think those are the ones you really need to know. Agricultural reforms, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Their job was, remember, to eliminate the oversupply, to try to raise prices. They would purchase farm products in order to destroy them, crops and or livestock. Labor, industrial reform. Remember, the industrial law was the NIRA and the NRA. They were basically just a series of codes, a series of agreements that labor and business agreed to, that they would both follow in order to try to recover the economy and get people back to work again. And then, of course, let's not forget about the very important Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, which guaranteed labor unions the right to collectively bargain officially for the first time ever. Major reforms, you do need to know the major reforms in the platform, the BRIC platform in your notes. You need to know those big ones because many of them might still be around today. Obviously, Social Security, by far the most important. That, of course, is unemployment insurance, disability insurance, and, of course, pensions for the elderly, all provided through government accounts. Next question. How were the goals of the Second New Deal different from that of the first? Second New Deal was more recovery and reform programs, whereas the First New Deal had focused more on relief and a little bit of recovery. So the focus is different. Secondly, of course, tremendous success for the support for the first deal. Of course, support's going to slowly deteriorate as we get through the Second New Deal, as we get up into those late 1930s. Next, why did FDR attempt to pass the Judiciary Reorganization Act? Remember, because they were blocking all of his policies, or not all of them, but at least enough of his policies, and he wanted to put enough people on the court that they would support New Deal legislation. What would it have done? It would have forced judges, remember, to retire at 70. If they didn't, he could appoint a new judge to the court, up to 15 if necessary. What was the official result? Remember, Congress voted against it. There was tremendous public pressure against it. A lot of folks believed that maybe it was FDR going a little too far. Some folks started to throw out words like dictator, like he was abusing his authority, abusing his power, trying to bully the other two branches. And of course, that was, in the minds of many Americans, just too much. So we start to see the first hiccup in the New Deal as a result of the court packing. What were the basic ideas of Keynesian economics and trickle-down? Well, Keynesian, remember, is FDR and what liberals and progressives believe. It's when times are bad in the economy and the businesses start firing people, laying them off. The government needs to step in. They need to borrow money if necessary. They need to create jobs for the people and keep them afloat until the private businesses recover enough to be able to hire them back themselves. Then the government cancels those programs, raises taxes, and pays off the debt that they went into. That's the program, the belief that FDR had and that liberals have throughout this era and all the way up till today. Trickle down, remember, more conservative, more self-reliant. Remember, business tax cuts for the wealthy. High tariffs to protect businesses, very limited government regulation, if none at all, so that the governments don't interfere with businesses' costs. No real attention to the environment, for instance. You try to reduce the effect of labor unions to keep those costs down. Businessmen oftentimes, in this instance, ran the economy or ran the government, sort of a little bit like today. All of those things, accurate. Who were the major critics of the New Deal? What were their major critiques? Major critics, of course, the National Liberty League, conservatives, argued that the New Deal was socialist and or communist and had gone too far, it was too radical. The other critics, all of them, argued that FDR hadn't done enough. Remember, the first was Father Charles Coughlin, argued that FDR didn't do enough to control the banks and help the working class with banks. Ultimately, remember, Father Charles was discredited because of his anti-Semitism. Huey Long, remember, the famous politician, the Democrat, challenger to FDR for the Democratic Party. Share the Wealth program, give $5,000 to every family in this country. Huey Long ultimately was assassinated. Otherwise, he may have given FDR a big run in 1936. The most famous and probably successful of the challengers was Dr. Francis Townsend. He, of course, led opposition along with the elderly to the fact that there was, not opposition, but he raised awareness to the fact that the elderly didn't really have any protections. And the elderly protests led to FDR in his second term supporting the Social Security Act, which of course ends up being passed. Why did New Deal support die down in the late 30s? Okay. One, the court packing, I think, started to cause people to hesitate on FDR's too much authority. Two, at this point, the New Deal's been going on for 6 or 7 years. And I think some folks are starting to look towards international affairs and what's happening with Germany and other countries instead. Lastly, remember, there was a recession in 1937-38. Remember, FDR took his foot off the gas. He stopped funding some of the programs because he thought he could do that. When he did that, we slid into a recession. A lot of Americans interpreted that. One, blamed him for that, and two, interpreted that as a failure of the New Deal, that we were back in a recession again. So in the elections that followed, remember, the Republicans won a bunch of seats in Congress. They were able to block FDR's policies from that point forward. What eventually ended the Great Depression? The build-up to World War II. First supplying England and France with supplies, and then later on, supplying ourselves with supplies. The last section, let's check on the timer. It's going well. We're only 15 minutes in. We're flying through it, folks. All right. And what did the Ford D. Macomber and the Hawley-Smoot tariffs do? And what effects did they have on the U.S. and world economies? Okay. Well, these two tariffs were massive tariffs. They raised the tariff rate to super heights. And if you remember, they were there to protect American businesses, which is what the conservative presidents wanted to do, because they believed protecting business was the key to American power. Of course, the problem with that was we got hit with tons of retaliatory tariffs. And if you remember, Hawley-Smoot was actually issued during the Depression because Hoover miscalculated and thought it was Europe's fault. So at a time we needed to be opening trade with no barriers with the rest of the world to try to hopefully recover before the Depression got too bad, these tariffs prevented us from doing so. They were disastrous to the economy in the end of the 1920s, even though they had been pretty successful during the middle of the 1920s for us, during the Roaring Twenties. What was the Dawes Plan and why did the U.S. negotiate it? Well, the Dawes Plan, remember, was the American plan, negotiated by American Charles Dawes, to loan Germany money after World War I, so Germany could pay their reparations payments to England and France, so that France and England could pay their loans to us. Now think about that. We make money on the loans to Germany through the interest we get back, and we also make money from France and Britain. One, we get our original loan money back. Two, we get the interest from them for that loan. So the Americans made a bunch of money after World War I, thanks to the Dawes Plan, by taking advantage of the war reparations. Now you know that the reparations were necessary partly because the United States required England and France to pay us back our debts after the war. Why did we negotiate it? Because the debts were almost about to stop. The payments were about to stop because Germany's economy was suffering so badly after World War I. Describe examples of the United States isolationism through the 20s and into the 30s. Kellogg-Briand Pact, remember? It tried to outlaw war. It tried to make war illegal. Of course, immediately when countries engaged in war, none of the people that signed the treaty actually stepped in to stop them. So it was a worthless treaty. It's typical of the treaties of the 20s and 30s the U.S. signed that sounded good on paper, but the moment somebody broke or violated them, nobody that had signed the treaty stepped up and blocked them. The Washington Conference and Five Powers Treaty, remember, that was in D.C. We negotiated a naval treaty to avoid an arms race. Remember, it gave us a false sense of security because, one, we would build, it was a battleship rule. Remember, we could build 5 battleships, so could England, and then the Japanese could only build 3 for every 5 that we built. So it gave us a false sense of security that we would have a supremacy in battleships against the Japanese. Well, one, the Japanese secretly built battleships. Two, at this point, the battleship was already becoming obsolete, and the aircraft carrier it was the new power ship, and the Japanese started building those because they were not outlawed by the conference. Our failure to sign the Versailles Treaty and to join the League of Nations, remember, was based entirely on the fact we didn't want to give up control over our decisions. We didn't want to give up decision-making and have to go into a war if the people or Congress opposed, even if the rest of the League of Nations told us that we had to. That's why Congress and the Senate never ratified. What was the Good Neighbor Policy? And what are some examples of how it was implemented? The Good Neighbor Policy is our new policy in Latin America. We rejected imperialism. We gave up on intervention and removed all our troops. In addition to that, we announced we would begin to give up some of our territories and grant independence, for instance, in the Philippines. We said we would do so in 10 years. So it's just a change in our policy where we're going to view Latin America more as equals, I think. We're going to mutually enforce the Monroe Doctrine instead of us enforcing it on them. We're going to enforce it together and sail around together and protect Europe or others from entering our hemisphere, not just the United States'. What was the Hoover-Stimson Doctrine? How was it a reflection of American isolationism? Hoover-Stimson Doctrine, after the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931, President Hoover issued a declaration that we wouldn't recognize their seizure of the territory. All that meant was that we refused to allow them to take it legally. Japan laughed at us and simply took it and didn't really care whether we recognized it legally or on a map or not, because they owned it, they possessed it, and they held on to it. So ultimately, it was another example of weak American response, where we basically wagged our finger at them for taking over Manchuria. Why did the U.S. separately issue the Neutrality Acts of 35, 36, and 37, and what did each of them what did each of them order? Okay. The 35 was in response to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Aggression 1. 36 was in the Spanish Civil War, and 37 was the Japanese invasion of the rest of China. And what did they do? Remember, they said, hey, Americans aren't going to supply weapons to either any warring party. We're not going to allow Americans to travel on their ships. We'll sell non-weapons, but only on a cash and carry basis, where you got to pay cash and you got to come pick it up. All of it designed to prevent us from getting caught up in a conflict, even though we were selling weapons. Remember, we said we would only supply democracies down the road. What was the Spanish Civil War? How did by the way, we had a Neutrality Act of 39, which eventually is going to say we're going to be able to start selling weapons. What was the Spanish Civil War? How did the U.S. officially reply to the conflict? Remember, it was a civil war in Spain between fascists and a democratically elected government. The U.S. declared neutrality. Of course, thanks to the help of Germany and Italy, the fascists were able to win power. What pledge did FDR make to the American people during the election in 1940 that he'd keep us out of the war? Another shout out to the isolationism that was still strong in the country. What was the role of the Committee to Defend America? By the way, he was already making plans to try to get us into the war when he made that promise. What was the role of the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies and the America First Committee? Well, America First fought for isolationism. They tried to keep us out of the war. They were led by very famous and wealthy Americans who wanted to keep us out. Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies was the opposite. They tried to encourage us to become more internationally involved, to get behind and support the democracies, to do everything short of actually entering the conflict. How did the four... And by the way, both of those groups fought over kind of popularity, tried to getting more support from the American public throughout the war. How did the four freedom speech, the quarantine speech, and the Atlantic Charter reflect growing American involvement? All right, well, we'll start with quarantine because that was the first speech. The quarantine speech, remember, was after Japan invaded China. FDR came out strongly against the invasion, argued that aggressive nations needed to be quarantined with economic trade policies by the other democracies. He was basically calling for like an embargo of Japan and maybe Italy. Remember, isolationists in the U.S. criticized him, and so he kind of backed down at that time. Four freedom speech happens a little bit later, a couple of years later. He basically says there are four freedoms that every democracy has to defend, like freedom of speech, freedom from want. And ultimately, he said, if any of those freedoms are being deprived, it falls on the other democracies to have to step in and defend them. So a lot of people consider this to be, again, him building up to declaring more active involvement in the conflict. And then, of course, the Atlantic Charter, another great example of him getting us more involved even before we were actually declared. He meets with Churchill before we're involved in the war. And he and Churchill plan out what the world's going to look like after the war is over. They talk about building, for instance, down the road, potentially a UN-like nation, like a UN organization. And so he's already looking at what the world's going to look like even before we're even in the war at that time. A couple of other questions. What was the destroyer for bases deal? Can I scroll down here? Oops. I'm all over the place. What was the destroyer for bases deal and the Lend-Lease Act, and how did they reflect growing U.S. involvement in World War II? Okay. So destroyer for bases deal is straight up. We sold 50 destroyers to Britain. They were old destroyers. We didn't need them. They were desperate for destroyers because that's the primary way you defend yourself against submarines, which the U-boats were killing the British. And in exchange for us selling them the destroyers, we got 8 bases around the world from the British, that many of which we still have today. This was a win-win for the Americans and for FDR. We could support the British, and we still were able to get something huge from it as well. The biggest policy of the war was this, the Lend-Lease Act, and you must know it. This is how we economically helped to win the war more than any other. Beginning in 1940, we began actively supplying the British, and eventually later on the Soviet Union, when they get in the war, with massive amounts of military hardware, weapons, ammunition. We did so without requiring them to pay. We told them they could pay us later after the war was over. It was called the Lend-Lease Act. We only did it for democracies, we only did it for Britain at first. And we basically were the arsenal. We supplied the Allied cause with the weapons that they needed. Eventually, we were supplying huge parts of the Soviets as well until they were able to really turn into a massive economy as well. So the Lend-Lease Act is almost like an unofficial declaration of war. We're going to just pretty much supply the Allies from this point forward, even way before we're involved in the conflict. Eventually, the last question, what directly led to our entry into the war? Well, remember, the war started in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland. We were neutral until late 1941. And then December, of course, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. They tried to knock out our Pacific Fleet. They wanted to deal a crippling blow to us because they believed a conflict with us was inevitable. Why? Because just prior to that, we had recently cut off oil supplies to them because they were using that oil to take over more and more land. We cut off our oil sales to them. They realized, they believed that meant sooner or later we'd be in conflict for that oil, so they might as well take the first shot. This is Mr. M signing off. All right, I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.